The work is called All That Is Solid Melts into Air, which is a quote from the Communist Manifesto. And it's about Marx's concept of commodity fetishism, whereby commodities seem to have metaphysical properties even though they are material things. They seem to have those metaphysical properties because they obscure the labor relations that produce and distribute them. I wanted to focus on the most important commodity, which is oil, and so I looked at it from the two different endpoints of its production and distribution. I went to Nigeria, to the Niger Delta, which is one of the largest oil fields in the world, and I filmed with the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, which is a militant guerrilla movement which seeks to alleviate the poverty of the region by redistributing the wealth of the oil resources. The people of the Niger Delta live in miserable poverty, even though they are wealthy in oil. It's stolen from them by the government and by the oil corporations, notably Royal Dutch Shell. So they are freedom fighters. On the other screen, it's a two-screen installation, two screens facing each other, and the screens are synchronized, so they're of equal length, about roughly 15 minutes. And although the films are independent of each other and they exist as individual films, they're in dialogue with each other, so the editing is synchronized. And so they're both at the same time two separate films and simultaneously one film. On the other screen, I filmed at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is the largest exchange for futures and derivatives. Futures and derivatives are complicated financial products. I was particularly interested in futures, which are contracts by which people or corporations agree to buy or sell a certain commodity at a certain fixed price in the future, which means that really, if it's an oil futures, for example, the oil doesn't exist yet, the money doesn't exist yet, and in fact, they might not even own that which they are trading. It might be even borrowed. So this contract, this money, this agreement is so far removed from the material reality of the commodities that it's entirely speculative and practically metaphysical. And so on either end of the spectrum, whether it's disappearing into the thin air of the financial markets or being stolen from under the feet of the people for whom it is the birthright, oil just disappears completely into the economy. I make most of my work about the relationship between ideas and material reality. And usually my work involves political militancy or religious ecstasy, and those moments where belief is so transcendently held that it becomes real. And what was interesting to me about the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, or MEND, is that they believe that they are bulletproof and invincible because of the blessings of their local gods and religion. And I was lucky enough to be able to film some of their rituals. Their religion, which is not logical from our outside perspective, these religious beliefs somehow can inform a struggle which is really historical, materialistic, and that they can have such intimate knowledge of this commodity, which on the other end of the system, which is financial capitalism, where it's very scientific, this scientific economic system, and they have no idea of the reality of how it's produced. The film is also very much about the future and what is to come, not only because, of course, the traders are buying and selling futures, and I like the lyricism of this idea of buying and selling the future, but also the Nigerian militants are talking about how their revolution will come to stay and how it is inevitable. And that is something I do believe, that this kind of inequality is unsustainable, and that probably through conflict there will necessarily be redistribution of wealth and resources. In the Chicago Mercantile Exchange section of the film, the financial section of the film, I used animation and After Effects as well. There are some shots in the film that are composited, that are different sections from different shots taken and basically put as a collage. And on a few of those shots, you might not notice it. And then on one of the shots, at first you don't notice it, and then it becomes clear as the images are basically pulled apart. The idea behind that was twofold. Firstly, I wanted to think about how I could represent a futuristic aesthetic in a film about the future. And then also, my film, this one, but all of my films are about the difference between the world as it's perceived and the world as it is. And most documentary, almost all documentary, there's this equivalence between what you see and what you can believe. And so documentary is often considered evidence, and that's why it's journalism. And I'm trying to develop an anti-journalistic documentary, basically anti-empirical. And so I'm starting from a philosophical point that isn't empiricist, but instead phenomenological. And with phenomenology, we have we have this idea that the world, we don't have access to the world as it exists, and instead phenomenon are pieced together in our imagination. We perceive a bunch of different things, and then we make sense of it in our brains. And I try to show that in the film by taking a bunch of different phenomena, compositing them into something that looks real, and then pulling it apart to show that it's a construction. And so it's kind of self-deconstructs in a sense. And in that way, I was hoping to also shift or break, actually, the rules of time and space that normally hold cinematic logic together. Because the reason that cinema works and convinces us of, or to suspend our disbelief, and the reason it looks so much like reality is because objects in a moving image are usually laid out in the same synchronicity and perspective, in the same time and space as we perceive reality. And I wanted to show that that is not absolute but relative. Or one of the major influences of the financial aspect of the film was city symphonies, which were a movement of early cinema, best exemplified by Walter Ruttman's movie Berlin, or Ziga Vertov's movie Man with a Movie Camera, in which they try to portray a collective rather than an individual, and the narrative the narrative resembles a more musical narrative rather than a theatrical narrative, and that influence, and it's usually about an urban setting, and so was one of the main starting points. And in London, we often refer to the financial section of the city as the city, and I thought it would be interesting to try to find the real kernel of the city. I mean, the documentary aspect of my work is that I always have this necessity to find the realist of all situations and to find the heart of the matter, and going into the heart of darkness of you, if you will, of capitalism, or the heart of darkness of, African neocolonialism and seeing, the beating heart of the financial industry or the beating heart of the oil industry, and showing them at the same moment. That's what I was really going after.